This episode is the World Literature Podcast's first foray into children's literature, and I will be talking with Dr. Jessica Medhurst about Xu Lu's Goodbye Little Un, translated by Paul Graves. Goodbye Little Un is an uplifting story of perseverance against the odds, and one that stresses the value of reading and of education. For readers outside China, it also offers a fascinating window into both Chinese history and into the idea of childhood across different cultures. Welcome to the World Literature Podcast. My name's Ivan Stacey, and on this channel we discuss literature from around the world, delving into the places, people and ideas brought to life in fiction, drama and poetry. In each episode, I invite an expert to give their views on a text or author, and today I'm joined by Dr. Jessica Medhurst, who's Senior English Editor at Dolphin Books in Beijing. I hope our conversation inspires you to read Goodbye Little Un, and if you have anything to say about the story or our conversation, please leave us a comment. If you enjoy the content, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. And stay tuned for details of a competition, which we'll provide during this first part of our discussion. Jessica Medhurst is Senior English Editor at Dolphin Books in Beijing. She holds a PhD from the University of Reading, and she held a postdoctoral post at Newcastle University, which was based at Seven Stories, the UK's Centre for Children's Books. She's worked in China for a number of years, first at Ocean University in Qingdao, which is home to two leading scholars in Chinese children's literature, Zhu Ziqiang and Xu Derong. And after that, she took up a post at Beijing Normal University, where I was fortunate enough to be her colleague. It's a pleasure to welcome her to the show. You're joining us in the offices of Dolphin Publishing in Beijing, where I'm talking to Jessica Medhurst. Thank you so much for joining me, Jessica. Great to have you on. So we're talking about children's literature today. Could you begin by saying a little bit about this book, Goodbye Little Un, and why people might find it interesting, either for themselves or for their kids, as a piece of literature?
Absolutely, yes, I have a copy of it here. I chose this book not because it's the most famous of books, although Xu Lu is a famous Chinese children's books author. He doesn't really have a profile in English. So it wasn't because of fame. It wasn't even because I think this is the book from China that I necessarily want to put in everybody's hands. But for me, this book speaks to so many different aspects of Chinese children's literature. So I think it's a really good introduction to Chinese children's literature in the novel form or the short novel form. It's set in the sort of 1970s-ish in the countryside in China. And it's the story of a little boy growing up in the countryside. If you know anything about the China in the 1970s in the countryside, you'll know he's growing up very poor. He doesn't have a lot of opportunities. And it follows a very familiar Chinese narrative where education is his chance for a better life. We meet him, we meet his family members, we meet other students at a number of schools that he goes to, including Little N. And there are also some plots in the kind of subplots in the background with adults' lives. It's kind of experienced through a child's eyes, but this is a retrospective narrative, so it's experienced through an adult remembering a child's eyes. Yeah. And through that, we also get a number of women's stories as well, and thinking about the ways that women were kind of swept up in some of these historical events as well.
Brilliant, thank you. That's a great summary to start with, and we'll go into some of the detail later on as we talk. But can we start just talking generally, on this channel, this is the first time we talked about children's or young adults literature. And, this is something you've studied, your doctorate was in children's literature. So when you're studying children's literature, what are we doing that's different from studying literature written for adults?
Absolutely. So we are doing maybe some different things, but I guess when I'm studying children's literature, I'm not doing anything different from when I'm studying adult literature. But broadly speaking, if people are studying children's literature, there are three main ways they might be doing it. One of them would be from an educational perspective. One of them would be from a social and historical perspective, and one of them would be from a theoretical perspective, which is my perspective. The development of children's literature as a form of literary criticism came through education. It's like all those brilliant librarians and teachers desperate to put good books in good kids' hands, and then noticing the differences and the similarities between those books and developing theories from there and developing sort of ideas and schemata from there. And there's still a number of educationally informed literary critics of children's literature. They'd be interested in kind of ideas of quality and in the way the ideals, the ideologies within the books. Then we have the historical and social critics who are looking at it much more like we would examine literature for any age group, and thinking about the ways that these texts interact with wider society, the ways in which they reflect them, but also the ways in which they help form and construct those ideas. And then the theoretical perspective that I tend to take is really interested in the idea of childhood and what it means to be a child, and in how these texts are constructing that idea of what it means to be a child. There's a very famous children's literature critic who kind of spawned this, Jacqueline Rose, who talks about the impossibility of children's fiction, because it's for children and it's of children, it's about children, but it excludes them utterly because it's not written by them, it's not bought by them, and it's forever telling the child what they ought to be like, whilst claiming, I am about you. So looking at those kinds of ideas.
Wow, that's a really interesting paradox I hadn't thought about, and if we can come back to some of those as we discuss Little N, that would be great, And I mean, so that's a really useful kind of overview of what we're looking at when we're looking at children's literature. Now let's go to China. So in China, are there big differences with, I guess, how children's literature is seen, maybe how it's produced, maybe theoretically, in terms of some of the angles you just talked about, and then also where does Goodbye Little N fit into all of this?
From what I've noticed from some of the excellent critics studying children's literature in China, there tends to be more of a sway towards the educational perspective and the social historical perspective. Not that critics aren't engaged with the theoretical perspective, but it's maybe a facet of the other two rather than something someone would be dedicated to. I've got a number of ideas about why that might be. Maybe you can indulge me. I can give you a little bit of a history of children's literature because
absolutely, yes.
I think the reasons are historical. So if anyone's familiar with Western children's literature, this is very broad strokes, but we can say it kind of came out of the Romantic movement. The Romantic poets like Wordsworth and Shelley and Coleridge and Charlotte Turner Smith, these people who are writing about nature, they're writing about childhood innocence, and they're writing in vernacular English. And they're doing this at the end of the 1700s, beginning of the 1800s. There was a children's book in English before that in 1744, which is a fascinating thing to study, but it was much more of a publishing sort of capitalist attempt. It's maybe a story for another time.
And so if you're starting with this book in 1744, there was nothing before that in terms of...
Before that, it was mostly primers and sort of things that we would now recognise as textbooks. The earliest kind of book for a child... We could go back to the maybe mid-1400s. We have horn books, which are these kind of flat paddles. They look like you could beat a child with them. They're these flat paddles made out of wood with a handle here, and then a piece of paper which you could write like the Lord's Prayer or the alphabet or something like this, and then a very thin slice of horn goes over the top to protect it. A lot of those can be found in America. They were taken over to America because they were quite sturdy. The horn would protect it, and you could like slide out the horn or take off the horn and put in something else to teach your child. But it's alphabets, it's pronunciation, it's prayers, it's things like this.
I didn't know any of this. This is fascinating.
Good. All right. So mid-1700s we've got the Pretty Little Pocketbook, which that publisher was so... I'm putting words in his mouth, but he was so uncertain about the popularity of this book that he offered a free gift with it. If you were a little boy, you got a ball, and if you're a little girl, you got a pincushion. So you can see there were already very gendered ideas about
this doesn't sound so different from 21st century free gifts and gender-specific
Exactly. So we've got this book. Then we've got this ideology from the Romantics, right? And they really are the first people who in any kind of cohesive way are talking about children as innocent. Children were not seen as innocent before then. And I think it's a really good point to kind of labour, because it's such an automatic idea for us now. We talk about the innocence of childhood. We're physically shocked when a child does something that we see to be not innocent. And a lot of our anxieties around childhood are if a child isn't innocent enough. But this is something that was constructed in the 1700s that didn't happen before. It led to a number of things, including shift in thinking that led to better working conditions, educational conditions for children. But it also, we can see it as the kind of the start of ideas around children's literature, because children were being seen as something to be protected, something that a special time that we could never get back to. Already nostalgia, which we might talk about with Goodbye Little N as well. But this idea of needing to get back to it and protect it. So that's the English concept. Around that time, we also have Hans Christian Andersen writing his fairy tales, The Little Mermaid and The Snow Queen and things like this.
Frequent point of reference in this book.
Right, and hugely important, because Hans Christian Andersen's stories made their way to China, and they were translated by one of the great May 4th fingers, Zhou Zuoren. He translated a number of books, but he translated Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales and advocated for them. For him, he wrote an article about humane literature and children's literature. I would say, because a Chinese critic has taught me, Zhu Zichang has taught me, that this was the man who kind of discovered children in China. Zhu Zichang is a professor at Ocean University of China in Qingdao, and he calls Zhou Zuoren the discoverer of children in China, because he's the first person who's writing about the idea that children are worth protecting and that they aren't mini adults. So although he's not getting his ideas directly from the Romantics, we can kind of see it's part of that same ideology. And crucially, they're writing, the May the 4th authors are writing in the vernacular Chinese, and this is one of their big things. So they're kind of combining this, but just in different ways through different routes.
Sorry, just to kind of give the context, May the 4th is a reference to the May the 4th movement, a kind of modernising movement, early 20th century.
1919, and they sort of kind of tumbled out of that. So we can see these influences coming together, and there were writers around the time who started trying to play around with this, and we have maybe the first Chinese children's book or Chinese children's story, The Scarecrow, by Ye Shangtao. But even then, it had a very obvious moral to it. It was talking about society. We also have a female author, Bing Xin, who wrote a collection of letters to children, but these are non-fiction rather than fiction. So there's a lot of debate about what the first children's book was, and actually Zhu Zichang says the ideology came first, the books came a lot later. But also history intervened. So we've got all of these ideas that, they're happening in the early 20th century rather than the early 19th century. But it's not so different. But there isn't then that kind of snowballing effect after that. There's a pause until the mid-late 1970s where we start seeing people pick up Zhou Zuoren's ideas again, which I think speaks to some of those differences, why Chinese children's literature still kind of emphasizes that functional characteristic, the education, the moral side. And there's a also within that big gap, there's a history of social realist children's literature, which of course then affects children's literature today.
Yes, okay. Brilliant. Great, thanks for that overview. Let's pause now to introduce our competition. So we have a competition. Yes. What are you giving away?
We're giving away 5 copies of Goodbye Little N, because as much as I said this isn't the book, I really, really want people to read this.
Fantastic.
And I want to hear what they think about it. So we have 5 digital copies to give away.
Brilliant. So if you would like to win a digital copy of Goodbye Little N, you need to do 3 things. Firstly, email Jessica.
Yes.
So it's Jessica at
dolphinbooks.cn.
Okay. Like the video, follow the channel. Okay. And we'll set the deadline of next Sunday, midnight, Beijing time. And from the emails that we received, we'll select 5 at random, and those lucky winners will receive a digital copy of Goodbye Little N. So, get in there, send your email, like and subscribe, and you can see firsthand what we're talking about. Okay, so we haven't talked much about the book specifically. No. So obviously the character refers to Little N is somebody in the book. She's not the protagonist. That's Xu Yanze, who's a young boy who grows up in this in the countryside and poor background and is desperate for education, as you've mentioned. And Little N is a young girl he meets at one point. They have a discussion. We'll sort of feed in maybe elements of the story. We don't give too many spoilers, but we'll feed in what's going on a little bit. Xu Yanze has various opportunities to learn and to read, and we'll come back to reading in a moment. But at one point, they have a discussion about whether or not it's better to grow up. And I'll just quote from page 38. And actually, she asks him, Xu Yanze, tell me, is it better for people to grow up or not? He replies, why do you ask such a deep question? How do you expect me to be able to answer something so profound? And then thinking about how soon we graduate, grow up, and be separated from each other, our hearts seem to fill with an infinite sadness. So this profound question, I think it touches on this idea of the construction of childhood and the idea of innocence you just mentioned. Do you think the story as a whole is thinking about this question, and does it have a kind of take on it?
I think it does have a take on it, and I think, again, this is perhaps an aspect we find in some Chinese children's novels, this nostalgia for childhood, even a nostalgia in a very difficult context. The idea that there is something that will inevitably be lost, and that act of writing about childhood as a way of failing to retrieve that loss over and over again. There's an interesting... I don't know enough about this, so if anyone has any ideas, maybe they can leave comments, because I'm really curious about it. I think there's a genre in Chinese children's literature, or maybe Chinese literature in general, of the fictional autobiography that we don't, or that I've never encountered in English literature before. I've certainly seen children's writers say that, I base this character on me, or this is loosely based on elements from my childhood, but they tend to be quite specific about what's true and what's not true. Whereas this, I've read a couple of, always in translation actually, but a couple of Chinese children's novels which the author says this is based on my childhood, or this is my childhood, but a fictional version of my childhood. And it just fascinates me, because of course we can do that. Of course you can fictionalize whatever you like. But as somebody who's learning about the era and learning about the country, I also find it kind of frustrating, because I want to say, like, did this bit happen? Is this bit true? But it also kind of just opens up, as you were saying, theoretically opens up a lot of questions about why one would fictionalize their childhood, why one would do that, and points out that, we do it all the time. Like if I tell you a story from my childhood, it's a memory, probably a memory of telling that story before of what I think happened. It's always going to be fictionalized in that sense. I think there is a lot of sentimentality in this book for childhood that we can spot in children's literature from a lot of countries. But I think if there is an anxiety about growing up, I think it resolves that anxiety. I don't want to give too many spoilers, but it has the idea that everything you think you might lose, you might not lose after all. Yeah.
And I mean, to go back to what you said about what we can call the construction of childhood in the Romantic period, this idea of innocence, this idea of protecting the child, to grow up, to have this concept of growing up, you need to have a concept of what childhood is and what adulthood is. So in that conversation, I mean, do you think the conceptions of childhood and adulthood in Goodbye Little N are what we would expect? Is there something... I mean, you mentioned there is a degree of sentimentality here, so is it this sort of typical childhood innocence thing, or is it a little bit different to that in some ways?
I think it's not the straightforward innocence of child leading to a certain situation for the child. I think the book is firmly entrenched in the idea that children are inherently innocent, but the things that happen around them might not be ideal for them. So there's a passage where the book right at the start opens with Xu Yanze being taken out of school to work with his family because his family is starving, the village is starving. they can't afford to send him to school. So there's that. There's also he goes to a city with an uncle to sell sweet potatoes in the freezing cold in order to try to get enough money to go back to school. So I think there's a lot of ideas that actually the society around them is kind of incorrect in its treatment of children at that time. But I think the book firmly knows that children should be treated in a certain way. And you know, it's a novel. It kind of needs to have a happy ending, but it simplifies the idea that education can be your gateway to this.
Yeah. And I think, just thinking as you're speaking, you know, I think one thing that really comes through in the book is the hardness of life in the countryside at that time, which I suppose might be absent from, I don't know, a story about a middle-class kid in Britain or somewhere having some adventures, right? So, and it almost dials up the importance of protection and, of course, education, because those things are not guaranteed, right? So, yeah, I think it does bring that into relief in some respect.
And I mean, these are very different examples, but I think we find these ideologies in British literature, for example, like in a very, very different genre, but Matilda by Roald Dahl. It's a very, very different book, but the idea there is that this child is inherently innocent, that the world around her is not treating her correctly, but through her intelligence and also her kindness and her magical ability. But I think the intelligence is important there. She'll get a better life. And we get these sort of misery memoir is the wrong phrase, but these stories of children who've had much harder lives as a way of kind of reinforcing that society is better now. We get that in English as well. Like we get a lot of books about the Second World War, something that is safely finished and that can be talked about in all of its horror, in order to say, but things are better now, and children are better off now, even though we know that some children aren't.
Yeah, okay. Brilliant. Well, thank you for those comments. I think it's a good point to take a pause.
Great.
So please do join us for part 2, where we'll go in a bit more detail into the book, actually this issue of the sort of context of China in the 70s and how that relates to the plot as well. So please do join us for part 2, and hope to see you then.